Okay, so today I want to talk about perception and pattern recognition from a cognitive perspective. Perception is, of course, a very broad area, encompasses a lot of different areas. We're going to take a limited perspective today and mostly look at some of the cognitive operations that intersect with perception. In particular, we'll talk mostly about visual perception and a little bit about auditory perception, with a focus on how it is that we're able to identify and recognize things in our world. There's a variety of questions I want you to consider as we talk about this. Why can two people experience different perceptions in response to the same stimuli? We'll take a close look at that. How does perception depend on a person's knowledge? How does the brain become tuned to respond best to things that appear in the environment? And how are perception and memory represented in the brain? This last question we'll get to after we discuss attention. We'll do a specific lecture on perception and attention in neuroscience. But think about those things as we talk today. First thing I want to introduce is basically what perception is. This is, of course, any experience resulting from the stimulation of the senses. We'll talk in a little bit about how sensation and perception are related but different events. Sensation is activation of the sensory systems. Perception is our conscious experience of that. Some basic concepts to understand are that our perceptions can change based on additional information, and we'll see some examples of that. It certainly involves a process similar to reasoning or problem solving. It's an inductive and deductive process that involves both information and some top-down processing. Perceptions occur in, of course, conjunction with other actions. In fact, our recent experiences and actions can alter our perceptual experience. So these are all important things to consider as we start talking about how the brain processes information and what are the cognitive processes involved in actually creating our perceptions. There are a couple of different theories we're going to talk about, or approaches to understanding perception. The first of these are what we call direct perception theories, and these involve what we call bottom-up, or sometimes they call data-driven processing. In this case, perception comes from stimuli in the environment, and parts are identified and put together, and recognition occurs, or some process occurs by which we actually perceive things in the external environment. So perception occurs in this idea based entirely on incoming information, based on the data that's incoming, based on sort of information, as we say, from the bottom up. Constructive perception theories posit a little bit of a different approach that involves bottom-up processing but adds an additional component, which we call top-down processing, or sometimes this is referred to as conceptually driven processing. And here, the idea is that people actively construct perceptions using information based on their expectations, their knowledge, their experience, etc. So it's a constructive process because we are talking about constructing perception from not only the data in front of us, or the sense, or the incoming raw data, but perception actually starts also with their brain, with a person's brain, their knowledge, their experience, and their expectations. So these are two different approaches that are complementary to one another. Top-down processing certainly involves data-driven or bottom-up processing, but perception is driven in a lot of part by information from the top down. I want to start by providing an introduction to one of the classic ways in which we approach understanding perception. And this is called the Gestalt Approach. The Gestalt psychologists were interested in a number of areas, and we've talked a little bit about this already, but they were interested in how we segregate objects and backgrounds and how our expectations and our knowledge drive perception. The first sort of simplest Gestalt example is what we call figure versus ground. And in this example, this is what's called the Rubin vase. In the Rubin vase, you can focus on the figure and see a vase or a chalice or something, or you can focus on the ground or the background, in which you can see these two faces facing one another. It's a relatively simple concept, but it's an important one. If you focus on the figure versus the ground, your perception dramatically changes depending on which you focus on. The Gestalt psychologist also had a number of principles of organization. Remember, the idea of Gestalt is that the thing you perceive is greater than, different than, or other than. It's something other than its parts just put together. You end up with a new perception based on the parts, and we'll see some of that as we move along. So the 5 principles we're going to talk about today are proximity, similarity, continuity or good continuation, connectedness or Pragnaz, which is simplicity or good figure. Proximity is very simple. Things that are closer together tend to be perceived together. So here, rather than seeing 6 individual lines, we see sort of 3 objects or 3 things rather than 6 individual things. And a lot of this has to do with simply simplifying our perceptual experience so that we can see things in an easier, rapid, more efficient way. Similarity, again, things that are similar are grouped together. So here we see 4 columns of items rather than 12 individual objects or even 3 rows. Another basic idea of similarity here. Here we've got one big whole group, but here we have individual columns based on their color. And then I love this example that really does provide an interesting demonstration of the Gestalt idea of perceptual organization. Because if you look right at that woman's midsection, it's almost like her head her midsection is floating above the rest of her body, because that white part of her outfit blends right in with the waves. And so you kind of get this kind of weird perceptual experience. Continuity is very simple. Objects that look continuous are, so this is what we would call good continuity or good continuation. So we kind of perceptually follow paths along this rope that make it look like it's one long rope. This could be 3 ropes, we don't know. But helps us perceive the rope as a single strand. Connectedness, things that are connected appear to be the same objects. These look like 3, say like little barbells, when in actuality they could be, it's actually circles and lines, and I know because I created them. Then finally, simplicity or good figure. This is really the most dramatic of the Gestalt phenomenon, and basically the idea is our brains use the simplest explanation, what provides the best figure and the best explanation. And in this instance, we see a triangle sort of laid over the top of the circles and the other triangle. When in actuality what this really is an angle and basically a Pac-Man, and another angle, and a Pac-Man, another angle. But we see this as a whole object because it's the simplest or most parsimonious explanation. Our brains work according to Occam's razor, provides the simplest explanation. Again, similar idea here. The simplest explanation is preferred, that these are all circles, rather than these are all individual objects. If you go to this link, which I'll provide on Blackboard, you can actually see a pretty good example of this and click on it and you can see the illusion and not see the illusion. So that's a quick introduction to the Gestalt principles of perceptual organization. I want to talk next about pattern recognition. And pattern recognition has to do with how it is that we recognize an object or event as being familiar and then provide some label or identity for that object. So we're going to perceive something in the environment and identify it. And this, of course, is what we do all the time. Letters, words, signs, symbols, faces, dogs, cats, coffee cups, all of that is a process of pattern recognition. We recognize millions of objects every day and never pay the least bit of attention to this process. So we're talking about face recognition. Speech recognition is another type of pattern. Even drawing a letter on your hand would be a type of pattern recognition. Identifying groups of tastes, identifying letters, words, all of this is pattern recognition. This seems to be a relatively unique human characteristic. Getting computers to recognize patterns has been difficult. They're getting better and better at it, but it really is difficult. It used to be, back when people still wrote checks, those funny numbers on the bottom of a check, if you simply were very aggressive in your signature and wrote something across that line, computers couldn't recognize the numbers, and so they'd have to input them by hand, and so you could get a couple extra days from your check clearing your bank. Now you can stick a check in the ATM, it reads the entire check and can tell you how much the check was written for. and deposit it straight into your bank. So computers have gotten much better at it, but still nowhere near what humans are able to do, or nowhere nearly the speed at which humans are able to do so. So one of the first sort of times we're going to look at different competing theories in explaining a phenomenon is pattern recognition, because it's one of the simplest instances where we can directly test two theories against one another in an experiment. And so if we look at the first of these, it's called template matching theory. This is an old theory about how we identify stimuli in the environment. The idea is that patterns are identified by stored templates for each uniquely recognized item. Each stimulus is compared to find a good match, and then the appropriate label is given. And so basically we're going to take a template and compare it to a stimuli in the environment. There are other more modern versions of this where we're comparing what they're looking at to some sort of prototype, and we'll talk more about those kind of theories, prototypes and exemplars, when we get to categorization. And they're not entirely separate events. Here we're focused on the perceptual aspect of it. We'll focus more on the cognitive aspect of trying to categorize and sort of sort out our world based on our knowledge later on. So some problems with template matching theory have to do with some phenomenon that it doesn't handle very well. And the first of these is what we call pattern variation. So there are a whole bunch of different ways to write the letter A. There are different kinds of fonts, different handwritings, etc. Yet somehow we're able to identify all of these as the same letter A, even though they're all completely different. So in order for template matching theory to be correct at its basic principle, we'd have to have a stored template for each of these unique examples. And that's obviously not a particularly parsimonious explanation. The next problem is with what we call varied orientations. And essentially we can recognize patterns regardless of which way they're pointed. So in this example, all of these are the letter A, even though they're all in varied orientations. Now we do know, and some of the support for template matching theory, is that the further a letter is from being upright or completely upside down, the longer it takes us to recognize it, because we essentially have to mentally rotate it to its appropriate orientation. And that was taken as early evidence for this idea of template matching. One of the other big problems with template matching theory is it can't really solve for the problem of Gestalt phenomenon, in particular this good perception. So here we have the perception of a three-dimensional cube, when in actuality there's no cube there. We are creating this Gestalt phenomenon through, again, the most parsimonious explanation. But it seems difficult, if not impossible, to match a stored template to recognize an object that doesn't exist. So it doesn't really hold up well in terms of explaining these phenomena. Finally, the last couple of problems with template matching theory are dealing with novel stimuli. So not every phone looks alike. Certainly what we recognize now as a phone, somebody from 20 years ago wouldn't recognize as a phone. So we have to be able to figure out how to deal with novel stimuli, somebody's new handwriting you've never seen before, a car model you've never seen before. You're still going to recognize it as a car. And the problem is that an infinite number of templates would then be required. The second predominant theory in explaining pattern recognition are what we call feature theories, or feature detection theories. And the basic idea here is that certain defining features and their combinations are the central recognition strategy. Each item is then associated with a common set of features. So the basic idea is, rather than having to have an individual template for each item we can recognize, as long as the features are there and they're combined in the right sort of way, we can recognize it as what it's supposed to be. And there's a variety of evidence for this, and we'll take a look at some behavioral evidence today, and then we'll also look at some neuroscience evidence in the weeks coming. So this is the basic idea. Put all these features together, we end up with the letter A. relatively straightforward idea. This is accomplished by what we call analysis by synthesis, where the features are extracted from what we call the sensory register. The sensory register is a very short-term memory system that just holds onto a blank copy of our external world for a couple hundred milliseconds to give us a chance to process that information. So we then match these stored features that we've extracted from the sensory register, compare them, and then make some kind of decision to decide whether or not we've recognized an object. So at that point we can decide, yes, this is what we think it is. So a recognition decision is made and the thing is matched with whatever it is that it's supposed to be. So we extract those features from sensory register, compare it with what we know, and end up recognizing things. And all this happens, of course, incredibly rapidly. One of the direct predictions of template matching theory are what we call perceptual confusions. And the idea here is that it's harder to recognize a stimulus if it's embedded within things that have a bunch of other features in common. So the number of features that stimuli have in common makes it more likely that we'll have perceptual confusion. So it's more difficult then to detect differences in stimuli with large numbers of shared features. This was discovered by Ulrich Neisser, and in fact the demonstration I had you do on your own this last week is tied directly into Neisser's work, and we'll talk more about that next week. For now, we'll talk a little bit about that study here in just a moment. So it's more difficult to detect a stimuli when it's embedded in with a bunch of things that are very similar to it. And that should come as no surprise to you. If you're out, or for the easiest example, if you're at the airport trying to find your luggage on the luggage carousel, a lot of bags look alike. So if you have a black or a navy blue or even gray luggage, it's pretty tough to find because it looks just like all the others. That's what we call a perceptual confusion. So when somebody ends up taking the wrong bag, it's because of that perceptual confusion. Now, of course, you can fix that by adding something unique that makes it stand out. And of course, a lot of people do that. They buy different colored luggage. They tie something onto the bag itself to solve this problem of perceptual confusions. So when we're talking about other ideas of where perceptual confusions come in, letters that share similar features, people that look a lot alike, like identical twins, different model years of the same car, different versions of the same car, etc., have a large number of shared features and are often hard to tell apart. So, visual search demonstration I had you do on your own is based on an experiment by Ulrich Neisser. We'll look at the data in closer detail in class when we get back, hopefully next week. But the basic idea is when you looked at for an item that was embedded in a feature similar background, so there was a Q that was embedded in with O's and R's and P's, it was much harder to find than when that Q was embedded with M's and Z's. Similarly, when the Z was in with the M's and V's and W's, it was much harder to find than when it was with the O's, the R's, the P's, and the G's. And so basically what that demonstrates is that perceptual confusion is real, that it's harder to detect a stimulus if it's embedded in with a bunch of shared features, and as a result, template matching theory can't hold up to that result because template matching theory predicts that we're just comparing templates, whereas feature theory predicts this idea of perceptual confusions. So that data supports the idea of feature matching, or feature detection theory. So that solves one of those problems, such as perceptual confusions, the problem of different orientations, different pattern variations, and some of that Gestalt phenomenon. Keep in mind that Gestalt phenomenon that we looked at a minute ago had some features. There was just a little bit of filling in. So we have to add a little bit of more information to this idea of feature detection theory, but if we go back to this, you can see that there are features present that are extracted, and then there's a synthesis that puts those all together. So let's go back to where we were. So we solved that Gestalt phenomenon. The problem is that feature theories don't solve all of our problems and have some problems of their own. So we'll talk a little bit about some additional information we might need to try to understand how we recognize patterns. And the first thing that I want to use to demonstrate this idea are what we call bidirectional image. And these bidirectional images are the exact same stimulus that can be seen in different ways. These can be seen in different ways based on your mood, your recent experience, your knowledge, your expectations, etc. So the first of these is just a series of objects. This is what's called the Necker cube. And basically you can see the Necker cube as this here being the top, or this square as being the top. So you can kind of flip it back and forth. Similarly, this cubert thing, you can see it as a staircase going up, or you can flip it. So that this is the top of the boxes, and then it's kind of going down. Similarly here, this is kind of like a bench, where this is the back and the side, or you can flip it so it's upside down. This would be the side. This you can see is going forward or backward, and this is just the impossible trident. This is a really interesting and slightly disturbing photograph from an old site called IllusionWorks, where you can see one person staring out at you or two people staring at each other. This is an old piece of artwork. Give you a second to look at that. There are at least 3 faces embedded in this, possibly more. There's one here, a nose and a mouth. There's one here. I think there's one here, or I'm just seeing things. This is an old illusion called Wife Mother-in-Law. This is the one on the top is the original, which can be seen as a young woman that's looking away, or an old woman. This is her mouth. If you look at these other versions, they're biased in one particular direction. This one's biased towards the young woman. This one's biased towards the old woman. This is actually the original of this. It was an advertisement. I don't know what they were advertising, but it was an advertising postcard. This is called Husband Father-in-Law, to be fair. And here you can see a young cowboy or an old cowboy. I'll let you pause this and try to find each of them. This is another one of my favorites, although it's getting a little bit out of date. You look at that and assume that it's Bill Clinton and Al Gore, but if you look more closely, it's actually 2 different pictures of Bill Clinton, and it's actually Bill Clinton standing behind Bill Clinton. What's happening here is your expectation is that Al Gore is the one standing behind him, not himself. You wouldn't expect that. And so what this all leads to is an issue of trying to come up with a good explanation for how all of this works. So those bidirectional images are a problem. Another problem is coming up with what are exactly defining features. There's always going to be some sort of exception to the rule that doesn't fit the defining features. Chairs are a perfect example. No way to come up with a set of defining features. The idea of a chair. Same thing with dogs, cats. There's always some exception. Some have tails, some don't. One dog's going to have 3 legs. So you always have to really understand that defining features is going to be a tough problem. Another problem with feature detection theory, or template matching theory for that matter, is they don't handle what we call context effects. And there's a well-known, well-established phenomenon called the word superiority effect. And it's just simply that participants are faster and more accurate at finding a letter contained within a word than within a non-word. And that doesn't work for either of these theories on their own. Because if we're just detecting features, it shouldn't matter if it's a word or not, and certainly it shouldn't matter for template matching. So to give you an example, if I were asking you to find the letter K, you'd be much faster at finding it in the word ticket than here. Now, template matching obviously can't account for that because you're still matching templates. And feature detection theory or feature theories can't account for this either, because this is embedded in the same amount of features. It's just in a word here and a non-word here. So that provides the idea of context. So context is one of the things that's driving our perception. So we have to get top-down processing into our theory somehow. One of the other issues with context effects is you can actually see the same stimuli in different ways. So for example, here we have the number 13 or the letter B. So our context is entirely driving our perception in this case. Sorry for that interruption, but I could not take the advancing slide sounds any longer. So, letter 13, letter B or the number 13. And what's happening with all of these phenomena I've just talked about, the word superiority effect, the bidirectional images, the context-driven perceptions, is they only involve bottom-up or data-driven processing. When we talk about bottom-up processing, we're talking about the analysis of objects into parts. Processing starts with those basic units, and our perception is then built on the foundation laid by those units. Something I talked about at the very beginning of this lecture is we're talking about just our sensory experiences driving our perception. And so we take those parts, like in the feature by synthesis, put them together, and drive our perception that way. Certainly that's an important part of this, but it's not the entire story. Perception is clearly influenced by our higher cognitive processes, things like context, things like words versus non-words, things like our mood, our recent experience, etc. Top-down processing is where our global knowledge helps us to detect patterns. Processing is based on higher level information, such as meaningful context, observe our knowledge, experience, biases, emotional state, etc. So our experience is coming in to help drive our perception. This is also sometimes called conceptually driven processing. So it's not just the senses, our senses, that are driving our perception, but our knowledge and our experience. And that becomes very important here in a minute when we're going to start to talk about some applications of cognitive perception in things like look but fail to see accidents, because our expectations are incredibly important in driving our perceptions. So the basic idea is this. We have sensory input, we have what we know coming into some sort of pattern recognition device or process, which then tells us what something is. And that's how we get our conscious experience. I want to round up our discussion of different ideas of pattern recognition. We'll talk a little bit about what Biederman's theory of recognition of complex stimuli. The central question here is, can the approaches we've talked about with relatively simple things be expanded to more real-world stimuli? There are similar issues, top-down or bottom-up processing, we have context effects, and then just put a note here, there's some evidence from neuropsychology that's going to become important when we start to look at associative agnosia versus apperceptive agnosia. And those are two important key things to think about. So the basic idea here in this of recognition by components is we begin by breaking down objects into components, just like feature detection theory. We examine those combination of components in memory to see which object might match our combination. So basically we have components, break those components down, and then we use those components and their combinations to try to figure out what our perceptual experience is. As part of this is basic primitive forms called geons. These are these simple 3D geometric forms that we can then put together into various perceptions. So we can take a cylinder with elbow macaroni, for want of a better word, combine them together, we get a cup or a pail, or we can instead add a cone and end up with a lamp, all that sort of thing. There are some really important components to understanding how this works. Edges and lines, where things are connected, are really critical component of our recognition process. So if you obscure these critical pieces, it's much harder for us to understand what something is. This is the whole purpose behind camouflage. Camouflage is supposed to break up the outline or shapes of whatever it is you're looking at. So military camouflage is designed to break up the lines on a person. And then when they face paint camouflage, it's designed to make them look not like a face. So it's supposed to hide the basic components of a face, and that's how camouflage works. So the process here starts with parsing. We start by breaking down an object into its subcomponents and then noting where they join together. Again, that's why these conjunctions are so important. The pattern is then matched to stored representation, and again, edges are critical, and where components are joined are also critical. And again, that's the whole point of camouflage, is to hide the edges and to hide where things come together in order to not recognize that it's a person and hope they just blend into the background. Okay, so that's recognition by components. I want to spend a little bit of time just showing you how different sensation is from perception. We see a lot of things that aren't there, or see them very differently from how they are. The simplest of these is what we call the Hermann grid. If you focus on, say, this central junction, you'll notice these peripheral junctions all look darker, like they've got dark circles splitting around them. They aren't there, it's just a simple illusion. That has to do with center surround antagonism in the visual cortex. If you want to take sensation or perception, that's the course to learn a lot more about this. But simply stated, those lines aren't, or those spots simply aren't there. Classic Mueller-Lyer illusion, which is actually culturally based. Very Western kind of illusion where this line looks longer than that line, when in fact they're the same length. Same idea here. The Ponzo illusion, these two lines are actually the same length. I'll show you some other versions of that. This is one that I came up with. Clearly looks like this line is longer than the other, but if we take away the background, you can actually see they're the same length. The amazing thing is we can reinstate the illusion and make it go away again. Again, another one of my favorites is the Ponzo illusion. The two monsters are actually the same size. Many of you may have seen this picture. That makes it look like these spiders are the size of a dinner plate, when in actuality they're big spiders, don't get me wrong, but they're the size of a tarantula. They're a normal sized spider. It's just a Ponzo illusion based on the angle of the photograph. So when we talk about sensation and perception, sensation is the product of our sensory information, but perception is our experience of those sensory experiences. So obviously perception is based on sensation, but it's based on a lot more as well. So there's much more to perception than just the sensory experience, but actually our perceptions as well. And that becomes very important when we start to talk about what it is that someone saw in an incident. So if we're talking about something like an officer-involved shooting, high stress environment affects our perception, our attention, our working memory, and we certainly can end up perceiving things that may not be there. So someone may have thought they saw a weapon and fire because of that. They may have mistaken one thing for another. Obviously very tragic, but we have to understand how to fix these problems from a scientific perspective if we want to have an important impact on these kinds of things. So you have to understand that what somebody perceived in a situation, while might not have been what actually was happening, it was their perception, and they can't help that perception at that time. What we have to do is figure out how to train people away from those perceptions. And some of the things that we talk about in these areas, like race, can alter our perceptions. And so it's an important part of this discussion, and we're going to talk more about that when we talk about stereotyping. But we can certainly see that it alters perception. So what we have to do is figure out how to get things like race out of this perceptual question so that everyone's perceived the same way. And it's a really important thing for us to focus on. It's important questions that psychologists can answer. So I want to finish up our discussion related to a little bit what we just talked about, which is talking about perception and what we call human performance, which is how people perform in real-world situations. One of the most common things that can happen on the roads is what we call a look but failed to see accident. A common factor in these automobile accidents is a failure to see an object even though you're looking right at it. And we'll revisit this under attention, but people can look right at something and not see it. And we've all done this. We've all been looking for our keys, and they're right in front of us. Or the remote to the TV, and we just don't see it. Or in the car, we just don't see something. Hopefully it's nothing tragic. But it's just human nature. So most of these accidents are due to us relying on our experience rather than our perception. One of the things that happens in automobile accidents is an inability to perceive that a car isn't moving. So when we're driving down the highway and we see cars that are oriented in the same direction as ours, we assume they're moving. One of the things that officers are trained to do is when they stop their car, they should stop it on the side of the road at an angle, because you know that a police car isn't traveling, at a 45-degree angle down the highway. And that way you know that car is stopped. And so when you get off the highway, if you have to stop for some reason, park your car at an angle, 25, 30-degree angle to the freeway, so that people know that you're not moving. Because they might round the corner, see where you are, and think that's where the lane is, and then plow right into the back of you. And it's a really important lesson. It's similar with friendly fire incidents in the military. Oftentimes it's due to a combination of events, but again, expectations can play a role in these kind of incidents as well. I want to finish out talking about one issue in perception that's just an important, I think, note in terms of our abilities, and that's how we localize sound. We'll talk a little bit about language and stuff later, but sound localization is how we know where a sound is coming from, and it's based on what we call the intraoral time difference, and it's really dependent on sound frequency. I don't know if you've noticed on campus, but whenever there's a helicopter landing at the hospital, it sounds like it's landing on the other side of campus because the sound bounces off the buildings so well here. So it's almost impossible to ever tell where that sound is coming from. Well, a lot of that has to also do with the sound frequency. So basically what's happening with sound localization is sounds are hitting one ear, and then sometime later, not very long later, are hitting the other ear. And that time difference allows us to figure out if it's coming from above or below, and from the left or from the right. And so basically it's like this. So the time difference it takes the sound to reach one ear versus another is this interoral time difference. Now, one of the problems we have is, and this is one of the things I think that happens with that helicopter sound, is if something is the exact right frequency, it will sound like it's coming from the front or the back, and we can't tell. So one of the functions of the pinna, the outside of our ears, this little part right here, is to help us localize sounds a little bit further. But so this sound over here, we know it's coming from the right side because it's going to hit the right ear first, followed by the left ear. The problem is we cannot locate low frequency sounds using this cue, and it really just depends on how big your head is. But low frequency sounds or bass tones, we can't tell where they're coming from because they'll only hit one ear versus the other. So this sound wave will hit this ear, but it won't hit the next. Whereas this 6,000 hertz tone, we can hear pretty well, and again, because it creates this acoustic shadow that doesn't occur from a low frequency tone. It's the reason why you can place a subwoofer anywhere because you don't know where that sound is coming from. Important to understand when we talk about attention, we'll talk about visual and auditory attention, but we can direct our attention to specific sounds. That is, we can tune into a specific frequency or particular tone of voice. And finally, there are clear top-down influences in our auditory perception. Anybody who's ever gotten out of the shower to answer a phone that wasn't actually ringing, that they heard ringing, because you might have been expecting a call, has fallen prey to this idea. So oftentimes we'll think, oh, I'm expecting an important call. So you'll be in the shower, and the sounds in there are just close enough to the sound of a phone ringing that you'll get out and answer a phone that wasn't ringing. Same thing with language processing. A lot of times you'll hear what you wanted to hear, or you'll fill it in wrong, etc. So here's some summary questions and some good review questions for you to take a look at. I'll post this PowerPoint to Blackboard. Here's some key concepts to look over for quizzes and exams, and I will see you all next week. Have a great weekend.